My name is Dakota Kollar, and for my TED-Talkish, I'm going to talk about McCarthyism. McCarthyism was named after Senator Joseph McCarthy in 1950 by Washington Post cartoonist Herbert Bloch. Though McCarthy's reign of terror lasted from 1950 to 1954, the Red Scare of communism in America started earlier in 1938 under FDR with the formation of the House Un-Americans Activities Committee. It led to hearings of suspected communists. In 1948, the biggest fish that was caught by this committee was Alger Hiss, who was a high-ranking State Department official who, instead of being charged with espionage, he was charged with perjury during his committee hearing for saying that he was not a Soviet spy. Also, there was the charging of espionage that led to the execution of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were charged with giving the secrets of the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. During Alger Hiss's investigation, one of the lead prosecutors was Richard Nixon, and he said that here we have one Alger Hiss, how many more are there? Which inspired a very famous speech by Joseph McCarthy in Wheeling, West Virginia in 1950 at the Women's Republican Club, claiming that he had a list of 205 names of known communists in the United States government. Though he was a senator, a lot of people tend to think that he had a lot to do with the House Un-American Activities Committee, but he didn't. He had his own Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations that was formed in 1953, and his appointed chief counsel was Roy Cohn, an attorney who is pretty much the reason why Ethel Rosenberg was charged and put to death, because the state didn't have very much evidence against her. They did for her husband, but not for him. Not for her. So this really set Roy Cohn up to be a national name. And he also had a personal assistant named G. David Schein, who these three men together wreaked havoc. And the reason why it was called McCarthyism was because it was led by Joseph McCarthy. But Roy Cohn was very instrumental in how these hearings went. And the hearings that went on more famously in this Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations was the investigation of the Voice of America Broadcasting and the Overseas Library Program that Roy Cohn and G. David Schein went overseas to American libraries and started bringing in the authors of these books that were associated or claimed to be associated with communists and the communist ideology, which led to a lot of the librarians to start burning books because they were so terrified that they were going to be hauled in front of these committees and questioned about their ideologies, because at this time, claiming the Fifth Amendment and not exposing your ideas of communism or your association with communism, if you had any at all, was akin to you were blacklisted if you didn't answer, because at that time, essentially, people thought, well, if you didn't do it, you have nothing to hide, so why not answer? And this led to a huge Red Scare and feeling of fear amongst the nation. Also, in around the end of 1953, G. David Schein was drafted by the Army, and Roy Cohn was trying to make calls to get his friend special treatment. And he was very threatening, and a lot of unethical things were going on between the calls between Roy Cohn and John Adams, who was the chief counselor for the Army at the time. And they were told to have a chronology of all the calls that Roy Cohn was making to John Adams about G. David Shine and all the terrible things he was talking about, just in case the committee tried to haul in the Army, which is what ended up happening. And what ties into this also is during the Truman term, he created loyalist boards that challenged ideas of communism, as well as they had, if you were a suspected homosexual, they would call you in also, because they figured that it's very easy for you to be blackmailed if you're a homosexual, because it was illegal at the time. And Eisenhower, when he came into office, they still had loyalist boards, but he signed an executive order to cover the board proceedings under executive privilege, so that if you came forward and you were called, that they didn't want to tarnish anyone's name who wasn't guilty of anything. So it was covered under executive privilege. And Roy Cohn decided to haul in a dentist named Irving Perez, who worked at Fort Monmouth in New York. And this led to the McCarthy Army hearings, which were very famous, and they were the only hearings that McCarthy ever had that were televised from beginning to end. The hearings were run by Senator Mund of South Dakota, because Joseph McCarthy had to recuse himself. The McCarthy Army hearings began April 1954, and the Army's chief counsel was Joseph Welch. His wit and humor exposed McCarthy as a vindictive liar and led to his famous claim, quote, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" end quote. And after these hearings concluded, Joseph McCarthy was censured by the Senate and essentially ignored. The media had wanted nothing to do with him, and neither did most of his colleagues. His death came in 1957 in relation to his excessive alcoholism, and that was the end of McCarthyism, though it wasn't the end of this innate sense of censorship of ideas that are opposing or differing than what may be normal. This is my project for TED Talkish. I hope it wasn't too long. Thank you for listening.